The workshop cost me $340,000. I signed the papers on a Wednesday morning in early October, and the realtor handed me the keys in the parking lot of a diner just off the highway outside Gatlinburg. She shook my hand and said she hoped I'd be very happy there. I drove the 40 minutes up the mountain with the windows down and the smell of wood smoke and cold pine coming through. And when I pulled into the gravel drive and cut the engine, I sat for a long moment just listening to the creek that ran along the eastern edge of the property. Margaret had found the listing. That's the part I keep coming back to. She'd been gone 14 months by then, and in those 14 months I had done a poor job of being alive. I ate badly. I slept badly. I went through the motions at the house in Knoxville, mowing the lawn, paying the bills, nodding at the neighbors when they waved from their driveways, but I wasn't really there. I was somewhere else, in some gray in-between place that I didn't have a name for. My doctor called it complicated grief. I called it waking up every morning and reaching for someone who wasn't there anymore. Margaret had bookmarked the listing on her laptop 8 months before she passed. I didn't find it until I was finally cleaning out her desk, trying to do the things you're supposed to do, and her browser was still open on the old MacBook because I hadn't been able to bring myself to close it. 6 tabs, a recipe for lemon cake, a YouTube video about reupholstering furniture, an article about native plants for Tennessee gardens, and a Zillow listing for a 3-acre property in the Smokies with a main cabin, a separate woodworking shop, a spring-fed creek, and a view of the ridge that on clear days stretched 30 miles east. She had written in the margin of her notepad, in that careful cursive I'd been reading for 39 years, "This one, when you retire." Finally, I retired 4 months after I buried her. I bought the property 8 months after that. I wasn't ready, and I also understood that I was never going to be ready, so I bought it anyway. And when I first walked through the door of the main cabin and saw the way the afternoon light came through the south-facing windows and fell in long, warm rectangles across the pine floor, I stood there for a while and let myself feel the full weight of her absence. It was terrible, and it was also, somehow, exactly right. I spent the first 3 weeks just getting the place in order. The cabin needed work, new weather stripping, a water heater that had seen better days, some rot in the deck boards on the north side. I did most of it myself. I am not a man who has ever been comfortable sitting still, and there is something about physical work, about the specific focus required to do a task correctly with your hands, that quiets the noise in a way nothing else does. I set up the woodworking shop in the outbuilding and spent whole mornings in there with the smell of sawdust and machine oil, making nothing in particular, just running wood through the planer and listening to the sound of the creek and occasionally looking up at the ridge through the shop window. My daughter Sarah called twice a week. I appreciated that. She lived in Charlotte with her husband Marcus and their 2 boys, and she was the kind of person who checked in because she genuinely wanted to know you were all right, not because obligation demanded it. We talked about the cabin, about her boys, about the book she was reading, about nothing much. It was good. Marcus called once, about 6 weeks after I moved in. I should say something about Marcus. He is 38 years old. He has been married to my daughter for 11 years. He is not a bad man, exactly, in the way that certain investments are not necessarily fraudulent, they're just structured in a way that serves everyone except you. He works in real estate development, which means he looks at properties the way a surgeon looks at a body, with a kind of calculating interest that has nothing to do with affection. He had been to the cabin once, the previous Thanksgiving, and I had noticed the way he walked through it. Not the way you walk through a place you're visiting, but the way you walk through a place you're sizing up. "How are you settling in, Raymond?" he said. He always calls me Raymond, not Ray, which is what everyone else calls me. Raymond, which is what my mother called me when I was in trouble. I told him I was settling in fine. "I've been thinking," he said, "and I want to run something by you, because I think this could actually work out really well for everyone." I waited. The Smokies rental market is extraordinary right now. Extraordinary. Properties up there are booking out 6-8 months in advance. I've got a colleague who manages a portfolio of 14 cabins in that corridor, and he's pulling in between $60,000 and $90,000 a year per property depending on the season. He paused to let that land. "Now, I know you paid $340 for the place, but properly staged and listed, you could see a full return on investment inside of 4 years. 4 years, Ray. And in the meantime, you'd have income that covers the taxes, the maintenance, all of it." I live there, I said. Right, obviously. But here's what I'm thinking, and just hear me out. What if you kept the main cabin as your primary residence when you want to use it, and we listed the workshop outbuilding as a separate rental unit? I've seen smaller structures than that listing for $200 a night in high season. You'd barely even notice the guests. They'd come and go from the side drive. It's my workshop, I said. I use it every day. I know. Or, and this is the other option I've been turning over, what if we just listed the main cabin during peak season? June through August. Maybe the first 2 weeks of October for the leaf season. That's prime booking time. You could stay in the workshop during those weeks. I'd be happy to handle all the management side, the platform listings, the cleaning crews, all of it. We'd split the revenue 60-40, with your 60 going toward maintenance and improvement. There was a silence. Marcus, I said, I'm not interested. I bought this property to live in. It's my home. I hear you. I just want you to think about it. At your age, having that kind of passive income, I'm 63, I said. Not 90. He laughed. The easy laugh of a man who believes every no is just a yes that hasn't been properly motivated yet. Just think about it, he said. That's all I'm asking. I thought about it for about 30 seconds after I hung up, which was 29 seconds longer than it deserved. My daughter called the following Sunday, and I could tell within the first 3 minutes that Marcus had talked to her before she called me. There was a particular quality to her voice, careful, slightly rehearsed, that I recognized from when she was a teenager and had something difficult to bring up. Dad, she said, Marcus mentioned he talked to you about the cabin. He did. I know it's your space, and I completely respect that. His heart is in the right place. He really is just trying to think about your financial security. Sarah, I said gently, I have a pension from 31 years of engineering, a paid-off house in Knoxville I rent out, and Social Security. I'm not in financial difficulty. The cabin is not an investment vehicle. It's where I live. I know, Dad. A pause. He's actually really good at this stuff, though. He's done really well with properties. Your mother found this place, I said. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence. I know, Sarah said very quietly. It was the last thing she bookmarked before she got sick. I'm not turning it into a rental property. I'm not sleeping in the workshop while strangers drink on my deck. This is my home, and it's where I intend to stay. I understand, Dad. I'm sorry he pushed. We talked for another half hour about other things. And by the end, it was good again, the way it usually was. And I thought that was the end of it. It was not the end of it. Marcus called again 3 weeks later. He told me, done some research. The property was zoned for short-term rentals under the county code. The outbuilding was technically a separate structure and could be permitted as an accessory dwelling unit. He had spoken to a property management company in Gatlinburg that was very interested. I didn't ask you to do any of that, I said. I know, but I think once you see the numbers. Marcus, I've told you no twice now. The answer is no. It will continue to be no. I'd appreciate it if you stopped spending your time on this. Another easy laugh. Ray, I'm trying to help you. This is a significant asset sitting underutilized. I utilize it every single day, I said. I wake up there. I make coffee. I watch the sunrise over the ridge. I work in my shop. I walk down to the creek in the evenings. I am utilizing it constantly. That's not what I mean by utilize. I know what you mean, I said. Goodbye, Marcus. I don't lose my temper easily. Margaret used to say I was the most difficult man in the world to rattle, which she meant as both a compliment and, occasionally, a complaint. But I noticed after I hung up with Marcus that second time that my hand was not entirely steady. Not from anger exactly, from something older and less clean than anger. The feeling of watching something you love being measured for a price tag. I called my attorney, a man named David Chen I'd worked with since before Sarah was born, and I told him what was happening. He asked a few questions. He sent me some documents to review and sign. I took care of some things. I also did something else. I bought 3 small security cameras, good ones, not the cheap kind, and I installed them myself. 1 at the front door, 1 covering the gravel drive, 1 covering the approach to the workshop. I set up the recording to save to a cloud account. My neighbor down the road, a retired postal worker named Gerald, who had lived on this mountain for 40 years, knew what I was doing and why, and he kept an eye on the place when I drove into town. I want to be clear about something. I did not believe at that point that Marcus would actually do anything. I thought he would grumble and drop it. I thought he was a man who ran calculations, and when the calculation came up negative, he moved on to the next opportunity. I did what I did because David told me it was prudent, and because something in the particular quality of Marcus's voice, the way he talked about the property, always the property, never the home, made me want to be prudent. I should have trusted my instincts sooner. It was a Thursday morning in April, 7 months after I'd moved in, when I first noticed it. I had driven to Knoxville for 2 days to deal with some things at the rental house, a plumbing issue, some paperwork. I got back to the cabin earlier than I expected because the plumber finished ahead of schedule, and when I turned onto my road, I saw a car I didn't recognize parked in my gravel drive, a white SUV with Georgia plates. I parked behind it and sat for a moment. There were lights on inside the cabin. I had not left lights on inside the cabin. I walked to the front door, unlocked. I pushed it open, and a woman came out of the kitchen with a coffee mug in her hand and stopped dead when she saw me. "Oh," she said. Who are you?" "I'm the owner," I said. "Who are you?" She was around 40, well-dressed, and she had the stunned expression of someone who has walked into a plate glass window they were certain wasn't there. We booked this through." She pulled out her phone, hands shaking slightly. "Through a listing. The Smokies Ridge Retreat. We have a confirmation." "There is no Smokies Ridge Retreat," I said. "This is my home. I did not list it. How many people are here?" "Just me and my husband. He's on the deck." She was scrolling through her phone. "I don't understand. We paid $600 for 3 nights. Her husband appeared from the back of the cabin. Mid-40s, wearing a hiking jacket, the look of a man prepared for a relaxing weekend who has just been informed that relaxing is no longer on the agenda. I asked them to show me the listing. They showed me. It was on a major rental platform. Professional photos of my cabin, photos I had never taken or given permission for anyone to take. My kitchen, my sitting room, my deck, the view of the ridge. The listing had 11 reviews and a rating of 4.8 stars. It had been live, according to the date on the profile, for 3 months. The host account name was a business I didn't recognize. I knew whose it was. I asked the couple to please gather their things. I told them I was deeply sorry for what had happened to them, that they had been defrauded, that I would help them pursue a full refund, and that this property had never been lawfully listed for rental by anyone with the authority to do so. The woman was gracious. Her husband was visibly angry. Though not at me, he understood immediately where the anger belonged. They left within 30 minutes. The woman gave me her contact information. I gave her David's. I called Gerald and asked him to come over. He arrived in 10 minutes, and he sat at my kitchen table and listened while I told him what I'd found. He is not a man of many words. When I finished, he said, "You called your lawyer?" "About to," I said. "Call him first." I called David. He told me to touch nothing, to save everything, and to send him the screenshots of the listing. He told me he had anticipated something like this might happen, which was why we had done the things we had done. I asked him what the next steps were. He explained them. When he finished, I sat for a moment. "David," I said, "how much trouble is he in?" There was a brief pause. "Raymond," he said, "depending on how many bookings went through and how much money changed hands, you are potentially looking at wire fraud, criminal impersonation, and operating a business without owner consent. The platform will cooperate because they have significant liability exposure. The county sheriff's department has dealt with this kind of thing before." I looked out the window at the ridge. The light was doing the thing it sometimes does in late afternoon in April, turning the whole eastern face of the mountain a deep, burnished gold that lasts exactly 12 minutes and then fades. "All right," I said. "I want to tell you about the next 3 weeks accurately, which means telling you that they were not dramatic in the way you might expect. There was no confrontation. There were no raised voices. What there was paperwork and phone calls, and on David's side, a series of communications with the rental platform, with the county sheriff, and with a civil litigation attorney he brought in to handle the fraud claim. Marcus, in the meantime, apparently continued operating the listing. He took 2 more bookings after the couple with the Georgia plates. Both sets of guests were met by Gerald, who was wonderfully patient with them and directed them to call David's office. I know now that Marcus believed I didn't know. He had set up the listing under a business name that wasn't immediately traceable to him, and he had used photos I hadn't given him. I figured out later that he'd taken them during the Thanksgiving visit, when he'd excused himself for a walk, and I'd thought nothing of it. He had planned this carefully, or he thought he had. What he had actually done was commit wire fraud across state lines in a jurisdiction with a DA who did not enjoy having his county used as a backdrop for fraud schemes targeting retirees. The morning the sheriff's deputies showed up at Marcus's office in Charlotte, I was in my workshop. I was building a small bookcase, nothing complicated, just white oak with hand-cut dovetails. The kind of thing Margaret always wanted in the bedroom. We never quite got around to furnishing the way she'd wanted. I had the radio on low. It was a Tuesday. My daughter called me that afternoon. She was crying before she finished saying my name. "Dad," she said. "I know," I said. They came to his office, Dad. In front of everyone. "Sarah," I said, "I'm sorry that you're hurting. I need you to know that I'm sorry for that part of this. Genuinely and completely. Did you know? Did you know it was going to happen today?" I knew it was going to happen. I didn't know the exact day. A long silence. "He listed your home, Dad. I didn't know. I want you to know. I didn't know it had gotten to this." "I believe you," I said, and I did. "I thought he'd dropped it. After you said no, I thought he'd just moved on to something else." "He didn't drop it," I said. She cried for a while and I let her, and then we talked carefully and honestly about what had happened and what would likely happen next. And she asked me if I could find it in myself to show some flexibility on the legal matter, and I told her that I loved her very much, and that this was no longer something I had control over. The platform had its own fraud investigation. The DA's office had its own case. I had signed my name to a criminal complaint because what Marcus had done was a crime, and pretending otherwise, letting it quietly disappear because we shared last names with the people involved, would not have been mercy. It would have been a different kind of harm. "He did this to strangers, too," I said. "That couple from Georgia, the people after them. They paid real money for a place they had no right to be promised." She didn't say anything to that, but I think she heard it. The weeks that followed were not easy. Marcus hired an attorney. There were negotiations I wasn't privy to. There were charges that were reduced, and some that stuck. He lost his real estate license in North Carolina, which was a consequence none of us had anticipated, but which the licensing board apparently considered quite warranted. His business partnership dissolved sometime in June. I heard about this secondhand, through Sarah, who was navigating all of it with a quiet dignity that made me very proud of her and very sad for her at the same time. She and I talked every week. We did not talk about Marcus much. We talked about her boys, about the summer, about a school play one of them was in. We talked about the cabin sometimes. She asked how it was, whether I was sleeping, whether the deck boards I'd replaced were holding up. She asked once if she could come visit, just her and the boys, not Marcus. I said of course. She came in July. She and the boys, one is 9, one is 7. And they spent 4 days at the cabin, and we hiked up to a waterfall about 2 miles from the property. And I taught the older one the basics of how to use a hand plane in the workshop, and in the evenings we sat on the deck and watched the fireflies come out over the meadow at the base of the ridge. On the last evening, after the boys were asleep, Sarah and I sat out there with cups of tea and didn't talk for a long time. "She would have loved this place," Sarah said finally. "She found it," I said. "I know." The creak was audible from the deck, a low, persistent sound like someone thinking. A barred owl called from somewhere up in the tree line, and after a moment, another one answered from further away. "Are you happy here, Dad?" I thought about that honestly, the way she was asking it, which was not as small talk, but as a real question. "I think I'm becoming happy here," I said. "That's different, but it's something." She nodded. She looked like her mother sometimes, in certain lights, in a certain angle of her face, and this was one of those moments, and I let myself feel it without looking away. "What I want to say, And what I have been circling around this whole time, because it is the hardest part to say plainly, is this. Marcus wanted the cabin to be an asset. He calculated its square footage and its proximity to tourist trails and its seasonal occupancy rate and its revenue potential, and what he came up with was a number. A return on investment. A line on a spreadsheet. What the cabin is the last thing my wife found before the world got smaller and harder. It is the place where she looked at a photograph of a pine floor and a creek and a ridge and wrote in her careful handwriting, "This one, when you retire." Finally, it is the place where, on a clear morning, I can stand at the workshop window with a cup of coffee and see 30 miles of mountain and feel, for however briefly, that time is not entirely the enemy I have been treating it as. You can't put a nightly rate on that. I've tried, in the abstract, to understand how someone looks at a thing like this and sees only a revenue stream. I've come up with partial explanations: youth, ambition, a particular kind of formation that teaches you to price everything and value nothing, but they don't fully satisfy me. What I keep landing on is simpler and less generous. He wanted something that wasn't his, and when I told him no, he decided my no didn't count. That is its own kind of theft, separate from the money and the fraud charges and the platform violations. The decision that someone else's no is just an obstacle to route around. I don't know what makes a person arrive at that. I do know that the law has opinions on the matter. Gerald came over for coffee on a Saturday morning in September, about a month after Sarah's visit. We sat on the deck the way we sometimes do, and drank our coffee, and watched a red-tailed hawk work the thermals above the meadow. "How's your daughter?" he asked. "Good," I said. "She's managing." "And the son-in-law?" "He pled out in August," I said. "Restitution, probation, the license is gone. No jail time." Gerald nodded slowly. He had the quality of a man who doesn't feel the need to pronounce judgment on things, which is one of the reasons I've grown to appreciate his company. "She coming back?" he said. Meaning Sarah. She mentioned October, for the leaf season. He looked out at the ridge, which in early September still had its full summer green, but would start to turn in 3 or 4 weeks, first the sourwoods going red, then the maples, then the whole mountain transforming in that slow, unstoppable way it does every year, with complete indifference to human events. "Good," he said. I refilled his coffee and mine, and we sat there with the hawk still working overhead, and the creek audible from the edge of the property, and the morning light doing what morning light does up here, which is arrive at a particular angle through the trees that you cannot quite describe to someone who hasn't seen it. I have been thinking lately about the bookcase, the one I'm building in white oak, with the hand-cut dovetails, for the bedroom. It is taking longer than it should because I keep stopping to get the joinery exactly right, the way the pins and tails fit together with just enough friction and not too much, the way a well-cut dovetail will hold without glue because the geometry itself is doing the work. Margaret would have appreciated that. She appreciated things that were made to last. I think she would have liked this mountain. I think she would have walked down to the creek in the mornings the way I do, and stood at the edge where the water comes around the big flat rock, and she would have looked at the ridge and said something I can't quite predict, something that was exactly right, in the way she always was. I think she would have had opinions about the garden I haven't started yet, and about the color of the deck, and about whether the living room needed more light. I think she would have driven me gently crazy with her certainty about where the furniture should go. I think about this most evenings now, sitting on the deck while the light fades and the first stars come out above the ridge. It is not a comfortable thought. It is not supposed to be comfortable, but it is also not the drowning sensation it used to be. It has become something more like weather present, familiar, something you dress for and move through and acknowledge, not something that stops you from going outside. The owl called again last night, the barred one from up in the tree line. I've been hearing it for months now, and I still don't know exactly where it roosts, somewhere in the hemlocks, I think, up on the steeper part of the slope, where I haven't explored yet. I'd like to find it sometime, not to disturb it, just to know. I finished my coffee and stood at the deck railing for a while, looking east at the dark shape of the mountain against the darker sky, and I thought about Margaret finding the listing, about that careful cursive on the notepad, about the 6 browser tabs open on a laptop I still haven't quite been able to close. This one, When You Retire. Finally, she was right. She was almost always right. I'm sorry it took me this long to get here, but I'm here, and it's mine.